Okay, so good morning. We're on lesson 71. Only God's plan for salvation will work. Um, I'm going to jump ahead to the second page because there's something interesting that happens throughout A Course in Miracles. It happens for a very good reason. When Jesus talks about certain things, and here's the line. He talks about the practice period. He says, begin the longer practice periods today by thinking about the idea and realizing that it contains two parts, each making equal contributions to the whole. God's plan for salvation will work, and all others will not. Now, the reason why he has to do this, and the reason why it works, because it's much like a centering prayer. It's much like a centering prayer in that it brings together both sides of the split in your mind and focuses them on a single point. And when they're both focused on a single point, and yet they seem to be in opposition to each other, it works much like bringing two magnets together. They come as close together as possible, but they can't actually join. And what allows them to join in that space where we recognize the need for the solution to be contained within the parameters of the problem that we're expressing is the ability for the light of the Holy Spirit to enter in and join the split in your mind with the same substance that your mind is made of, and that's wholeness and perfection. And that's the way this course works throughout. We're always attempting to focus both sides of the split on a single problem so as to heal the split or the separation in your mind. Because when the separation in your mind is healed, you see entirely different than you would when the split is working against you. You know, when you're going, well, I think I could do this, but then again, I could do that. That's what this is working to heal in your mind, the idea that there is an alternative to both what you are and how you think, therefore, how you experience yourself in the world, and how when you begin to experience yourself as whole, as perfect in this world, when you begin to see the continuity of being that you exist as and that you exist within, the ways of the world, so to speak, and the laws of the world begin to no longer be the operating principle within your mind and your heart, and you begin to operate under the laws of wholeness of the kingdom and the laws of love, the laws of a totality of being, rather than the laws of the split mind that attempts to legislate um, and and limit the way the mind and your heart and yourself and your being and their brothers can operate in this world based on the nature of the limitations that you enforce upon yourself in the split. Um, there's another great line here, which I know is entirely true, and I talk about it in a much similar way, but this is a perfect example. Um, Give him full charge of the rest of the day, of the rest of the practice period, and let him tell you what needs to be done by you in his plan for your salvation. Here's the line. His answer will be in proportion to your willingness to hear his voice. So the nature of the corrective principle, which is the Holy Spirit, is that he can only correct for you the amount of fear and guilt that you're willing to let go of based on the limitations that you establish within your own heart and mind um, through fear. So you can only let go of as much fear as you're willing to, but you're always here bound by fear and guilt. Now, the idea, this lesson, in a sense, especially at the beginning of the lesson, which we'll get to in a minute. The beginning of the lesson is telling you that the ego has a plan for salvation that can never possibly work. And the ego's plan for salvation is based on the holding of grievances in an attempt to protect yourself from the world around you, which you really feel has the ability to change so as to allow you to have the experience that you would like to have. And if there's a way in which other things would behave differently, act differently, be differently, then you wouldn't have to contend with them so as to not have to experience, the confusion, misery, and deep sense of failure and despair that you have in one sense, been experiencing since the beginning of time. But in another sense, only remember because of the condition of forgetting that this consciousness is made of, that you only remember in incidences that you think you've recovered from at certain times, but because of the nature of forgetting itself, you don't remember the consequences of the recovery as merely being a way to validate the problem so as to keep the problem rather than experience a totality of solution. And I saw something on the internet. That was written by our brother Abraham, through the people who allow him to speak through them, the Hickses, and it was talking about the idea of eliminating the actual energy patterns through non-validation of them, because when we maintain the energy patterns, we keep on drawing to ourselves the same situation over and over again in a myriad of disguises. And because the ego thrives on form rather than content, we seldom recognize the form, the content as being maintained, when the form of the problem seems to change so dramatically so as to allow us to forget that we've had the same problem previously in a different form. So the idea is, if we can eliminate the totality of that content rather than dealing with the form, then the content of our mind that causes us to experience the problem in its myriad forms possible here would heal the necessity for the compulsion repetitions of the situations that bring up the problem yet fail to allow us to experience the solution. There's an idea, and I was talking to a friend about it last night. In the 12-step program, many good addicts and many addicts who have healed themselves through the utilization of the steps, the 12 steps of the 12-step program. Many addicts were driven to their knees in desperation because there was no solution to the problem of the addiction that they were suffering from. There was no solution in control, as well as there was no real solution to the problem in abstinence, because the problem and ultimately wasn't the drinking or the drugging. The problem was within their own heart and mind, and necessitated the elimination for a moment or sufficient enough time of one of the symptoms, one of the effects of the problem, which was the drinking, so that you could finally find out where the problem really lies. So many people stop drinking, and then they find out that they still have the same old problems that they had, but they no longer have the ability to use alcohol in order to cope with those problems, so they go on and move on to another substance. And the substances here in space and time are unlimited, because our mind is unlimited in manufacturing. Time is limited, but the nature of the ability for our mind, which is infinite and eternal, to manufacture, to man-make solutions to a problem that can be simply solved by the application of a technique of healing that's introduced in the Course of Miracles, utilizing the Holy Spirit rather than something else in the world. And that's the entire difference. Instead of utilizing something in the world that actually validates the problem as having existence, the Holy Spirit, when we utilize the Holy Spirit, he shows us that the problem didn't really exist because we were never separate and our minds were never split. That's the nature of the solution that we're really looking for. And the more we exercise our right to use the Holy Spirit, the more we eliminate the ability for our mind to validate the form of the problems that show up, because the content of our mind becomes wholeness over and over again. The perceptual content of miracles is wholeness. But back to what I was saying before. So there's an idea, and it's expressed in the 12-step program quite rightly. And it says, in our desperation, when we finally get driven to our knees, and we've run out of options, and we no longer seek solutions where solutions are not, and we just simply abjectly surrender to God for no reason other than we have no reason not to anymore. I mean, that's, again, the nature of how the split in your mind is healed. The only reason we surrender is because we have no reason not to. And finally, when we put ourselves in that position, which here is considered to be a position of, in desperation, suddenly there's this flash of brilliant light that is not of this world, but is within us, that shows us that there definitely is another way that we can pursue that has nothing to do with the world. Now, the only problem with that is the ego being what is cunning, baffling, and insidious. It's the nature of addicted mind. Being cunning, baffling, and insidious retains the conflict and manufactures disasters over and over again. So it retains the content of the mind to manufacture disasters over and over again, so that we can continue to think that we need to be desperate in order to find the solution. And you don't have to be any desperate than this moment right now. And as it says here, his answer will be in proportion to your willingness to hear his voice. If your willingness to hear his voice is total, then you will hear the totality of the answer to the problem that you've been having of a split mind, thinking you're separate from God. In each and every instant, you're willing to apply it, and it will go way beyond the limitations that you've placed upon yourself in this world of space and time, and it will lead you to a condition known as the peace of God, wherein which the knowledge of the kingdom will be imparted to you, and you'll recognize that you never left. That's what the ego does not want you to know, and that's why all of its attempt to solve the problem of your need for salvation retain the problem without offering you a true solution, yet in the nature of the ability to change the form, you're allowing it to keep the content, if that's clear. Today's idea, only God's plan for salvation will work. Every one of you have experienced the problem of needing salvation. Now, it may not always be as clear as a salvation. It may happen in smaller ways in which you think that you're leading a good life and you don't need salvation because you got it all together. Well, I assure you, the energy that you're utilizing to keep it all together allows for the retention of the problem, and it is what brings about sickness, pain, suffering, and death. It's when we eliminate the problem by healing the split in our mind, which is the constant activity of the ego against everything, including itself. And that's the tension, the frustration, and the vibratory frequency of energy that is depleting and eventually leads us to death. And we don't have to do that anymore, because our brother Jesus was able to demonstrate that death is not real and it does not solve the problem. The problem is solved through the recognition that life is eternal and infinite, and that life is not of this world. I remember myself, and this is just an indication, this is, in a small way. It was something for me that at the time I didn't know what to do with, but later on, later on in my devastating moment, in the moment of devastation. And I don't know why I even call it that, because in the willingness to so totally surrender based on the desperation and the devastation I experienced my life at, something rose up in me and was given to me that allowed me to see that it was actually a miraculous moment rather than a devastating one, wherein which I was given the healing of my mind and my heart, the end of my addiction and need for substances to try to ward off, keep off the pain. And and all of a sudden, I found myself at one with my brother and at one with my father, an experience of knowing that love is our only reality. Um, there was a moment when I was an addict. I was a heroin addict. I began in my early 20s. And there was a moment living where I did, we had access to heroin that was pure enough to basically kill you if you did too much. And while I never injected it, I would have enough so that when I snorted it, I could get as high as I want to be for as long as I wanted to be. So I was actually, there was a moment, and I had whatever it was, whatever the substance I ingested, I was sitting on the floor watching television in my parents' home. And all of a sudden I knew I had done way too much, and if I closed my eyes, I would be dead. It was just that simple. I knew I had done too much, and if I closed my eyes, I would be dead. But having done too much, I had no longer any control over what my eyes and my body did, and suddenly I found myself to be dead. That's maybe hard for many to believe. I found myself to be dead, and I looked down on this body that was dead on the floor. And in looking down upon myself as dead, I had this sudden realization that my parents were going to walk into the house, see the body on the floor, think that the body was actually the son that they thought they had, perceive that son as having died in their home, and that would be a cause of great suffering and consternation and depression for them. Not only that, they would be left with the necessity to deal with the cleaning up of what remained, or they thought remained, of the life that I was in the world of space and time. And I saw, as I was looking down and seeing and realizing that I would still be around to know that, and that death was not the solution to the problem whatsoever, because there wasn't any such thing as death in regard to life. There was only a thing that looked like death in regard to the body and other bodies who were occupying space and time, and I happened to not want to put my parents and myself through that. So I made the decision at that moment that I was not going to die. And next thing I knew, I woke up lying on the floor in that room. Now, death does not solve the problem, although it is the last bastion of the ego's attempt to solve the problem. And in the utilization of death, it's a verification that the problem can be solved. Yet, death is also, to the ego, to the egoic thinking of the being of the body in space and time, death is also the idea that you can do something and not get the results of your own thinking. It's an attempt to be totally unlike you were created by your father. Oh, I'll just die and I won't get the results, yet someone else gets the results. That someone else is always you in another form, so to speak, and yet you go on without having solved the problem, again, to have to repeat the dilemma of space and time, which you just thought you left, and I assure you, you no longer have to do that. And I assure you that that's not what I'm doing any longer. I don't know how, in a sense, this sojourn in space and time, for me, comes to a conclusion, but I do know, having experienced salvation of myself and salvation of all my brothers, recognizing that life is eternal, I do know that there's an alternative, a totality of an alternative solution to the entirety of this problem. And that is God's plan for salvation, and that is the only plan that's going to work. Now, I don't know if all these things make me any good at delivering this message. I only know it's the only message that I have to deliver these days. And the workbook of A Course in Miracles and A Course in Miracles in general, thanks to our brother who was willing to put himself through what was necessary for us to live in the resurrection today. I only know that there's no other. There is no other way, as this lesson is saying, nor would you want there to be, because when we utilize the way that it's given to us by God and His plan, what occurs is in the fulfillment of our function, based on the plan that's been developed, the end of dreaming will preclude the ability for the dream of death to have ever existed, and no one will be able to enter or re-enter the condition of the necessity to die in space and time. So therefore, even though the suffering is perceived, the perception of the suffering is the experience of the suffering in your consciousness, and the fact that we can suffer is an indication that we don't remember who we are as eternal, whole, and perfect as love, and exist in a totality of reality rather than the partiality and limitations of space and time.